She's a professor of history at Santa Clara University in California, but she has a just-published book, Beyond Nature's Housekeepers, American Women in Environmental History. I haven't read it, but I'm going to get it just as soon as the symposium is over. We're so glad that you're here. Please welcome Nancy Unger.
When Sharon Kilzer invited me to give this talk, examining the relationship between Theodore Roosevelt and Robert La Follette, I was, as I'm sure you hear here all the time, delighted, as Roosevelt would say. And then when I learned that my friend Kathy Dalton was also speaking, I was even more delighted. It is an honor to be here, and I love talking about Robert La Follette. But my students always want to talk about Theodore Roosevelt. I try to bring them into the La Follette camp, but I know that they secretly, and sometimes not so secretly, still favor Roosevelt. So even though I'm thrilled to be here talking about Fighting Bob, it's a little hard for me to be here in the belly of the beast, you know, the Theodore Roosevelt Center. Just last Saturday, however, I was in La Follette land, Madison, Wisconsin, speaking at the 11th annual Fighting Bob Fest. Now, the Fighting Bob Fest is the largest annual political festival in the United States, drawing from 6,000 to 10,000 people every year. So this year I got the new edition of the Fighting Bob beer glass, the T-shirt, the water bottle, the canvas bag, and so thus fortified I am now ready to take on you Theodore Roosevelt enthusiasts and muse a little bit on why these two charismatic men who ultimately came to share an ambitious progressive vision could never manage to work together. Now, I assume that many of you are pretty up to speed on Theodore Roosevelt, but you may never have even heard of Robert La Follette. So here are the basics. Okay, he's born in Primrose, Wisconsin in 1855. He attended the University of Wisconsin for both undergraduate and law school. He served as a U.S. representative from 1885 to 1891, governor from 1901 to 1906, and in the U.S. Senate from the 1906 until his death in 1925. But who was he? So La Follette was only 10 months old when his father died. And his mother deeply impressed in the mind of young Bob the vision of his father as a completely righteous man. He must, she insisted, never do anything to dishonor his father's name, but instead always demonstrate integrity and do right without fail. So here he is, this little boy. He's already got this fabulous hair that's going to make him a cartoonist's dream. This hair is just great. In his youth, La Follette thought of this father constantly, writing in his diary, "Oh, my idolized father, what I would not give to have known the sound of your voice, to have received your approval when it was merited." His relentless quest to know more about this phantom father culminated when he was 39 years old. He had his father's grave exhumed, dug up, accompanying the gravedigger to the cemetery. La Follette personally gathered up the remains and brought them to his family physician to help lay them out for careful study. This is a man with father issues. From an early age, La Follette set out to merit approval by doing right. And you saw this cartoon last night. Early in his career, he realized that, quote, "the supreme issue involving all the others is the encroachment of the powerful few upon the rights of the many." La Follette applied the idea of protecting and enhancing the rights of the many more broadly than most, certainly more than Theodore Roosevelt early in his career. In 1889, for example, Representative La Follette lectured the white South from the floor of the U.S. Congress, quote, "There is nothing threatening or portentous in the Negro problem today excepting as you make it so. The difficulty does not lie with him, but with you instead, in the blind prejudice and stubborn antagonism ever opposed to his development politically and socially as a citizen. Follette believed that the acceptance of racial equality would benefit whites as well as non-whites, and he extended that logic to issues of gender equality as well, asserting, oh, I'm sorry, I missed that one. So there he is in the Congress. Here he is talking with women. He said that men as well as women would benefit from, yes, he used the F word, feminism. He advocated not only women's voting rights, but recognition of their full equality. Quote, "It is so obvious as to hardly admit of argument. The interests of men and women are not superior nor antagonistic one to the other, but are mutual and inseparable. Women's suffrage is but the extension of the principle of democracy and will result in a more enlightened, better balanced citizenship." When Follette left the governor's chair for a Senate seat in 1906, many of the state's reforms were eagerly adopted by progressive governors across the nation. Wisconsin boasted a thorough and efficient reform of railroads, and you've already heard how important that was. Railroads and other powerful utilities. Civil service reform for state officials. Lobbyists were required to register and to publish details of contact with legislators. Wisconsin boasted stronger provisions against corrupt practices, environmental measures, including forest conservation program, tax reforms, and nominations by primary elections for all elected officials. No more backroom deals. Follette brought his Wisconsin agenda to the Senate. President Theodore Roosevelt held at that time a rather moderate vision of reform. Quote, "My business is to see fair play among all men," said Roosevelt, "capitalists and wage workers. This square deal would not," he cautioned, "necessarily result in the major redistribution of wealth and power that was sought by Follette." Roosevelt said, "If the cards do not come to any man in this square deal, or if they do come and he has not the power to play them, then that is his affair. All I mean is that there should not be any crookedness in the dealing." The problems plaguing modern America, in Roosevelt's view, were abuses of the system rather than the system itself. Now, people's expectations from the freshman senator were high. The New York Globe envisioned Follette setting fire to his colleagues' whiskers. And after his first White House reception, the new senator noted wryly, "We were quite observed during the evening. I rather think that if I had been a wild boar led about by Mrs. Follette with a rope fastened to my hind leg, we would not have been more observed." Back in 1892, the Follettes had held a reception for Roosevelt in Wisconsin. 14 years later, President Roosevelt declared himself delighted, overjoyed to welcome Follette to the White House, stating it was one of the greatest pleasures of his life to greet again his old friend. Privately, however, Roosevelt considered Follette to be, quote, "not evenly balanced and dangerous to the general welfare of the country and the party." While Roosevelt found Follette too radical, Follette found the president's square deal tepid at best, and considered Roosevelt an insincere grandstander. Publicly, however, he called the president the dynamic force of moral indignation at crookedness and graft, and hoped only that he could aid the president in furthering the progressive cause. Well, the two did try to work together. They first conferred on the Hepburn Bill, an effort to give more authority to the Interstate Commerce Commission. Characteristically, Follette took 2 hours to lay out his proposed amendments. Roosevelt declined to offer his support because there was no way that Follette's proposals were going to pass. When Follette argued that it was the principle of the thing that was important, Roosevelt replied, "But I want to get something through," highlighting the great difference between the two men. Their uneasy alliance continued into the next year. Roosevelt again greeted La Follette effusively, but La Follette noted, "I never know how much he really is delighted." Roosevelt confided in a friend his true opinion of the Wisconsin senator. "We are for La Follette when he stands for certain big corporation evils. When he stands against certain big corporate evils, and against him when he goes to a foolish extreme or throws away the possible by demanding the impossible." La Follette often does real good in the Senate, and I like him a great deal better this year than last. I became utterly out of patience with his attitude toward that Hepburn bill last summer. But he also serves a very useful purpose in making the senators go on record, and his fearlessness is the prime cause of his ability to render this service. But even this grudging respect was replaced by disgust in January of 1907, as La Follette promoted a bill to withdraw federal mineral lands completely from corporate exploitation, and Roosevelt urged him to accept a compromise. La Follette was outraged that Roosevelt was interested only in what could be passed, not what was right. Roosevelt operated on the maxim, "half a loaf is better than no bread." According to La Follette, half a loaf, as a rule, dulls the appetite and destroys the keenness of attaining the full loaf. This idealism and self-righteousness put enormous strain on La Follette's relationship with Roosevelt, the man who achieved, seemingly effortlessly, all that La Follette coveted: power, mass love, approval, and the presidency. An additional element compounded La Follette's jealousy of Roosevelt. By everything that is right and holy, La Follette, literally born in a log cabin in rural Wisconsin, should have been the darling of the Midwest and the Great Plains. Growing up in Wisconsin, he understood the complex nature of the region's unique ethnic and religious character. When he first ran for office, he campaigned door to door by horse and buggy. His ability to speak passable Norwegian and his honest-to-God farming experience helped cement his reputation as a real man of the people. And what had Theodore Roosevelt done to deserve Westerners' respect and support? Well, sure, he'd spent the better part of 4 years in the Badlands of the Dakota Territory, but he was a New Yorker, for heaven's sake, from a rich, established family, as Kathleen Dalton has told us. La Follette was hardly alone in his puzzled outrage over the longevity of Roosevelt's popularity, even here in the Dakotas. In this cartoon from 1900, Democrats campaigning against McKinley and his then young running mate, quote, "get real mad at Teddy for getting solid with the Dakota girls." In 1950, La Follette believed that the West had something to teach the East and not the other way around. So there's La Follette, a Westerner, trying to teach this Easterner how the country should run. Roosevelt remained consistently unconvinced. In 1915, Roosevelt refused to support the Nonpartisan League, born here in North Dakota and eventually appealing to small farmers throughout the American Midwest, the Pacific Northwest, and into Canada. And yet, Roosevelt remained so beloved by so many, even in the Dakotas. I mean, here we have sheet music, comic books. There's no sheet music and comic books for Robert La Follette. I mean, and this just drove him crazy. La Follette found solace in increasingly perceiving Roosevelt as shallow, hypocritical, self-serving, weak, undeserving of the adulation lavished upon him by the public in the Dakotas and elsewhere. Things like Roosevelt as the baby Hercules really pissed him off. Nevertheless, La Follette enjoyed the widespread perception when he came to the Senate that as a scrappy first-term senator from Wisconsin, that he and the beloved powerhouse of a president had a relationship of increasingly shared goals and mutual admiration. And he fostered the speculation that he was the president's logical successor. That's certainly how he saw himself. La Follette continued to push for the direct election of senators, tighter trust and monopoly restrictions, exemptions of unions from antitrust laws. He wanted public reporting of campaign expenditures, all ideas that are part of our government today, but were rejected then, even by his own party, as socialistic. Certainly, as his presidency came to a close, Roosevelt, as Kathleen Dalton has told us, was becoming more radical. A square dealing of the cards was turning out not to be enough. Instability and harsh inequalities continued to plague the nation. Roosevelt and an increasing number of Americans were moving toward the more aggressive and interventionist reforms long favored by La Follette. But it was too late for any kind of truce between these two massive egos, even to serve the greater good. La Follette ended the Senate session with a filibuster. He spoke for 19 consecutive hours, a move that he considered a show of his determination and commitment that would vitalize his candidacy for the presidency in 1908. Roosevelt wrote privately, "Congress is ending with a pointless and stupid filibuster by La Follette, who is an entirely worthless senator." Roosevelt placed his considerable power behind William Howard Taft, who he trusted would carry forward Roosevelt's political agenda. All right, there he is with his little lamb. All right. His own, I know, I love this cartoon. His own hopes dashed, La Follette campaigned for Taft, but not exactly wholeheartedly. In La Crosse, Wisconsin, for example, quote, for about 4 minutes before La Follette finished his speech, he had gotten very worked up and had to take off his collar for the purpose, some of the boys said, of enabling him to say the word Taft, which he had been unable to pronounce up to that time. Now, as you know, once Taft was elected, the wildly popular former president took a long hunting trip in Africa, allegedly prompting banking giant J.P. Morgan to cry, "Health to the lions!" As Taft emerged from his predecessor's shadow, La Follette tried to cooperate with the new president, but as with Roosevelt, he could find too little common ground. And, warned La Follette, when Roosevelt returns, he will smear over and obscure the issues, make principles hazy, and exalt personalities, for he is not a progressive except with his tongue, and never was. In the summer of 1910, Roosevelt outlined to wildly enthusiastic crowds his program of new nationalism. This new plan that Kathleen Dalton outlined, planned for aggressive government action, echoing many of the reforms that La Follette had long championed. Despite their shared goals, the former president and the now influential senator now cordially detested each other. La Follette soldiered on in the Senate. He led some of the progressive movement's successes on the national level, making important gains in industrial working conditions, workers' compensation, electoral reform, education, public health, and women's suffrage. In 1911, La Follette played a leading role in creating the National Progressive Republican League, which advocated the goals of Roosevelt's new nationalism as well as the election of United States senators by a direct vote of the people. Although La Follette tried to persuade Roosevelt to lend his powerful name to the League, his letters were condescending, verging on insulting. Roosevelt fired insults right back, calling the League unrealistic and extreme. On June 17, 1911, La Follette formally declared himself a presidential candidate. He believed that it was his time. He remained committed to truly progressive ideals, and the American population was finally catching up to him. His critics mocked his ambition and his ego. Rumors that Roosevelt might seek an unprecedented third term haunted La Follette, especially because everyone seemed excited about Roosevelt entering the race. La Follette fretted constantly that if he proved that there could be a large progressive groundswell, Roosevelt would swoop in and take over. So here's La Follette not looking very happy as Roosevelt is singing away. And she is saying, "You sing better than Bob." "Even in my own camp," complained La Follette, "there were those undermining me every hour to force through a combination with Roosevelt." On the night of February 2nd, 1912, during a speech at the Periodical Publishers Association banquet in Philadelphia, La Follette gave way under the pressure. He gave a long, hostile, disjointed speech that was termed by the New York Times La Follette's political suicide. His enemies rushed to take advantage of the rumors of his so-called breakdown. So here they all are, so here's, who have I got here? Yeah, I don't know if you can see outside, they're saying, "Hooray, hooray for La Follette. Shh, La Follette is too sick to be a candidate." And then we've got Teddy Roosevelt saying, "Oh, what you need is absolute quiet." And La Follette saying, "Oh, I do not." So they're really trying to keep him down. As one-time La Follette supporters turned to Roosevelt, the former president poo-pooed the idea that he was in any way damaging La Follette's candidacy. Quote, "It's perfectly silly for La Follette to feel hurt at me. I have done absolutely nothing. If there was ever a perfectly spontaneous movement, this is it." 3 weeks later, Roosevelt announced his candidacy in typically colorful terms. "My hat is in the ring, the fight is on, and I'm stripped to the buff." There were a lot of hats in this ring. And we've got Roosevelt's, we've got La Follette's. Woodrow Wilson was the Democrats' nominee. La Follette, Roosevelt, and Taft were in a slugfest for the Republican nomination, and none of them held the monopoly on name-calling. La Follette called Roosevelt an inconsequential playboy, and Taft an easygoing fat man, willing but incompetent. Roosevelt termed La Follette half zealot and half self-seeking demagogue, whose impossible political goals make him the most contemptible and least conscientious of all of our foes. Taft called Roosevelt, I love this one too. Taft called Roosevelt an egoist and a demagogue, and Roosevelt escalated from describing Taft as a flub-dub with a streak of second-rate and common in him to calling the sitting president of the United States a puzzle wit and a fathead. In this cartoon, a frazzled GOP hostess is trying to keep party unity among her bickering guests. It was a long and ugly campaign. For a man who was said to have committed political suicide, La Follette made a surprisingly strong showing, as you've heard, in the North Dakota primary, which he won with 58% of the vote, compared to 39% for Roosevelt and only 3% for Taft. But La Follette entered the hotly contested and wildly controversial Republican convention with only the delegates he'd gathered here in North Dakota and in his home state of Wisconsin. Roosevelt and La Follette each accused the other of undermining their candidacy, while Taft, who controlled the party machinery, received the nomination. Roosevelt, as you've heard, announcing that he felt as fit as a bull moose, re-entered the campaign on the third-party progressive ticket. I think that the most outrageous and enraging thing Theodore Roosevelt ever did to poor old Bob La Follette was to get shot during this segment of the campaign. And in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, La Follette's home state. As Kathleen Dalton has said, the bullet enters his chest, and he says to the crowd, "Friends, I shall ask you to be as quiet as possible. I don't know whether you fully understand that I have just been shot, but it takes more than that to kill a bull moose." Right. He insisted on delivering his speech of almost an hour before allowing aides to take him to the hospital. As this poster says, "I don't always get shot during the middle of a speech, but when I do, I finish the damn speech." Yes. Oh, poor La Follette. You know, how do you compete with that? La Follette and Roosevelt waged their final battle over U.S. entry into World War I. La Follette had long opposed armed conflict, warning that, quote, war and rumors of war are a dreadful diversion for peoples demanding juster distribution of wealth. War is the money changer's opportunity and the social reformer's doom. War against powers abroad, he said, would supersede winning the war at home against monopolies, inhumane living and working conditions, and abuse of political power. Moreover, this foreign war, he said, would be financed not by the industries who stood to profit the most, but by American taxpayers who could afford it the least. La Follette remained convinced that the vast majority of Americans rightfully opposed U.S. entry, and he called for a national referendum on war. Ask the people. Roosevelt took the opposite position. According to La Follette's wife, Belle Case, the trouble with Mr. Roosevelt is that he is intoxicated with a false idea of war. There is no question that Roosevelt glorified war. He declared American entry into the war a sacred calling, but not only because of Germany's, quote, murderous offenses. In 1897, he had publicly proclaimed, "No triumph of peace is quite so great as the supreme triumph of war," and confided privately to a friend, "I should welcome almost any war, for I think this country needs one." When the Germans sunk the British liner Lusitania and American lives were lost, La Follette reminded the public that Americans had been warned not to travel on the ships of nations at war. Individuals voluntarily on armed combatant ships in time of war, he reasoned, shared the same risks with those remaining voluntarily in a foreign land during a revolution. Roosevelt responded, "The United States Senator who holds such a view occupies a position precisely and exactly as base and cowardly," and I use these words with scientific precision, "as if his wife's face were slapped on the public streets and the only action he took was to tell her to stay home." For his unflinching opposition to U.S. entry into the war, La Follette was spat upon, hung in effigy, and made the subject of a congressional investigation. Socialist and labor leader Eugene V. Debs, this is Debs right here, sent what I think is one of the best telegrams in American history. Quote, "Let the Wall Street wolves and their prostitute press howl. The people will sustain you, and history will vindicate you." On September 20th, 1917, La Follette spoke at the Nonpartisan League's convention in St. Paul, Minnesota, in favor of taxation rather than bonds to finance the war. Although he was openly critical of U.S. entry into the war, he did not say, "We have no grievance against Germany." But that's what the Associated Press reported in a story that made headlines in more than 1,000 papers coast to coast. The AP admitted its error and apologized 8 months later. In the meantime, Theodore Roosevelt, age 59 and enraged that President Woodrow Wilson wouldn't let him lead troops into battle, made his contribution to the home front to denounce La Follette at every opportunity. He repeatedly urged La Follette's expulsion from the Senate, calling him a liar, a sinister enemy of democracy, a shadow Hun, and the most dangerous political leader of the analog of the Bolshevik agitation. In the wake of the war, Roosevelt opposed Wilson's proposal for peace. When Wilson was praised for his idealism, Roosevelt snapped, "For heaven's sake, never allude to Wilson as an idealist. He is a silly doctrinaire at times, an utterly selfish and cold-blooded politician, always." A week before the Versailles Peace Conference began, Roosevelt wrote a typically forceful editorial denouncing Wilson's proposed League of Nations. The next morning, the bull moose was dead of a coronary embolism. Interestingly, it was La Follette who helped carry forward the anti-Wilson banner, varying Roosevelt's terms only slightly as he called Wilson a selfish, cold-blooded opportunist. La Follette noted the hypocrisy of Americans posing a League of Nations that would make the United States, quote, custodians of peace and instructors in democratic ideals to less enlightened peoples, while their own nation continued to be plagued with serious problems, including racism, sexism, and political corruption. He urged Congress, quote, whether the Russian government is good or bad according to our standards, it's not up to us to overthrow it. We have enough to do right here in the United States. La Follette outlived Roosevelt for 6 years. He remained in the Senate until his death in 1925, continuing his progressive crusade. It was La Follette who first charged in 1921 that there was a government conspiracy to lease federal oil lands to private companies. The resultant Teapot Dome scandal greatly enhanced La Follette's reputation as a defender of the public and an enemy of corruption and special interests, galvanizing his position as a still powerful radical in the U.S. Senate. In 1923, in his words, I went to Europe 5 years after the end of the war to end all wars, to make the world safe for democracy, 4 years after the so-called Peace of Versailles. And he described with chilling accuracy in 1923 the new world war that is now rapidly developing from the seeds of malice, hatred, and revenge that were sown at Versailles. And in 1924, despite serious heart disease, he couldn't resist one last run at the presidency on an ambitious third-party progressive platform. And it was during that campaign that the following 2-minute film clip was made. This is one of the earliest pieces of sound film. So you get to see La Follette. Remember, he's 69 years old. He's about to die of heart disease, but you'll still get a sense of what he's all about.
America is not made in the making. It has today to meet an impending crisis, menacing as any in the nation's history. It does not call a sound to arms, but it is nonetheless a call to patriotism and to higher ideals in citizenship. The patriotic citizenship of the country must take its stand and demand of wealth that it shall conduct its business lawfully, that it shall no longer furnish the most flagrant examples of persistent violation of statutes while invoking the protection of the courts, that it shall not destroy the equality of opportunity, the right to the pursuit of happiness guaranteed by the Constitution, that it shall keep its powerful hands off from legislative manipulation, that it shall not corrupt, but shall obey the government that guards and protects its rights. Mere passive citizenship is not enough. Men must be aggressive for what is right if government is to be saved from those who are aggressive for what is wrong. There is work for everyone. The field is large. It is a glorious service, this service for the country. The call comes to every citizen. It is an unending struggle to make and keep government representative. Each one should count it a patriotic duty to build at least a part of his life into the life of his country, to do his share in the making of America according to the plan of the fathers.
Yeah. I absolutely love that clip, and when I first got it and brought it home, my kids would say, she's in there watching that clip crying again. I was so excited about it. Like his nemesis, La Follette made an impressive showing as a third-party progressive. He got lots more votes than Roosevelt, but it doesn't really count because women were voting now. But he received roughly 17% of the vote compared to Roosevelt's 27% in 1912. It was a good showing, but it was not enough. He died the next year, 4 days after his 70th birthday. So what are we to make of this rivalry between Roosevelt and La Follette? Which of these was the real progressive? And the answer, as I thought was very well brought out in the question and answer with Kathleen Dalton, it's complex. All right. The fact that La Follette was more progressive when he came to Washington in 1906 than Roosevelt made both of them very wary of each other. Certainly their approaches to political challenges, La Follette's idealism and Roosevelt's practicality, left little room for compromise. But it was their gigantic egos, I think, more than anything else, that made any kind of real cooperation impossible. Today, the media denounces America's infatuation with personality politics, even as it does everything else to play up the candidates' private lives. But the relationship between La Follette and Roosevelt shows that issues of personality and character are not frivolous distractions, but can be just as important as political positions and beliefs. I think the country lost out when La Follette couldn't work with a powerful president, couldn't allow Roosevelt's realism to temper his idealism in order to gain real results. And it lost out again when Roosevelt realized that his square deal wasn't enough and he was willing to embrace the solutions of La Follette's that he had once dismissed as dangerously radical. But by that time it was too late. The animus between the two was too great. Roosevelt couldn't reach out to La Follette and lend his popularity and growing commitment to radicalism to La Follette's passion and experience. In 1912, even many progressives felt disgust with both Roosevelt and La Follette and their willingness to sacrifice party unity for personal vanity. It was said that Roosevelt had to be the bride at every wedding, the corpse at every funeral, the baby at every christening. As the British ambassador told another diplomat, "You must remember that the president is only about 6 years old." And La Follette said of himself, "I can no more compromise than I could by wishing it add 20 years to my life." It didn't help that he saw all those who didn't share his beliefs. He saw them as insincere at best, corrupt at worst. I find it difficult in my own life to put aside personal dislikes and distastes to achieve the greater good at work and even at home. But far more was riding on the ability or the inability of these two important leaders to put aside personal differences and find common ground. I don't advocate wishy-washy politicians, but I believe that in politics the art of compromise is paramount. The relationship between Robert La Follette and Theodore Roosevelt reveals not just the brilliance of each man, but for better or for worse, the role of personality in politics. Thank you.